If it does not make you too uncomfortable to do so, please close your eyes, and as I speak each line of the following, find the way in which it is true for you. I have been a rock in a long, winding road. I have been a patch of moss on a granite cliff. I have been a worm burrowing in the warm earth. I have been the warm earth through which the worm burrows. I have been a hawk on a high hill, digging its talons in the soft ground. I am flesh and spirit. I am bone and intellect. I am the God who kindles fire in the head. I will be a tree, reaching toward the sky, growing toward the light. Open your eyes. So I was raised Jewish. I was given a medicine name. I'm a practicing Druid and a studying Taoist. And I like astrophysics a lot. I think of myself as sort of a Zen pagan with a yen for Sagan. All of this drives my father-in-law crazy. He is a Southern Baptist minister who 2 weeks before my wedding sent a lengthy letter to my bride advising her not to marry me, as we would be on unequal footing and therefore could not spend eternity together. This was not all that upsetting to me because, quite frankly, I was already a little intimidated by that whole till death do us part deal. In retaliation, by the way, the night before our wedding, I took him out to dinner and spent the entire meal insistently talking about Jesus stuff and getting it wrong. I told him I had always admired Jesus for his immortality and his ability to turn into a bat when threatened. And he said, no, Dylan, that's Dracula. And but there was something about drinking blood in there, wasn't there? I was watching just the vein in his forehead throb. I told him I particularly like that part of the story where he sodomized the money launderers. And he said, no, not money. They were money lenders. Whatever. He turned them over their tables. It was good for everyone. No! Be that as it may. I am a practicing Druid. There's a small park near my home with a grove that I have sanctified for my own odd ritual purposes. I go there late at night now and again. A few years ago, on Halloween, it occurred to me that as this is a fairly important pagan holiday, I ought to do something. So as we neared midnight, I drove to my grove, found a space for my car across the street, and got out to cross the street. I was approached by a homeless man with a big bag of candy and a ghost mask pushed up on his head. Because Halloween is the one night of the year in America when a homeless guy can feel like a participant instead of a pest. He gave me a big thumbs up and smiled, and I smiled and gave him a big thumbs up and started to cross the street toward my sacred grove and was aware of this homeless guy crossing the street behind me and to my right, and it made me a little nervous. I reminded myself, this is my sacred space. Nothing can hurt me here. I am safe. I entered my grove. The homeless guy entered my grove. He sat down at the base of a tree to eat his dinner there. I shrugged and started moving around my grove, greeting each of the trees, which is what I do. I sort of touch them. I say hello. I thank them for absorbing my spent air and providing me with oxygen. We have a little moment. I ask them if they have any important wisdom for me. They pretty much just stand there and tolerate me. And then eventually I'm done and I go home. So I was moving around from tree to tree, and I was standing with my hands at the trunk of a tree. A group of 5 or 6 young Hispanic men, 15 or 16 years old, came into the park carrying long-necked bottles of beer and speaking fast Spanish and drinking. And I knew, demographically speaking, these are the people I am most supposed to fear as a middle-class white guy in a park near midnight. I reminded myself that this was my sacred space. Nothing could hurt me here. I was completely safe. The young Hispanic men took up a position about 5 or 6 feet away from me, totally unaware that I was standing next to the tree wrapped in shadow. And they were speaking Spanish. I was starting to feel like a spy, although I don't speak Spanish, so I felt like a bad spy. But I didn't want to be eavesdropping, whether I understood them or not, so I stepped away from the tree and I said, "Excuse me," and they went, "Ah!" And I said, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you. I'm a Druid. I'm using this grove just now. Could you come back in 10 or 15 minutes when I'm through?" And they spoke some fast Spanish, and they fanned out into sort of a loose semicircle around me, and one of them took up a position of leadership and stepped forward and said in a tone that may or may not have been vaguely threatening, "Excuse me?" And at this moment, I had a vivid and detailed memory of the world's stupidest mugging, of which I had been a victim some 14 years earlier. I was 21 years old, living in New York. It was January, and I was much farther north on the island of Manhattan than any middle-class white guy has any right to be as it is approaching midnight. I was sitting at a bus stop, waiting for the bus to come. My breath was steaming in the winter air. And a large African-American man, well, it was the mid-'80s, so he was still just a big black guy, came and sat down next to me. And we sat there next to each other with our breaths steaming in the night air. And after a few minutes he said, "Give me all your money." And I said, "What?" And he said, "I'm mugging you. Give me all your money." And I said, "Well, do you have a knife or something?" And he said, I could go upstairs and get a knife if you want." I did not want that. So I gave him my money. I had $6 in my pocket that I gave to this man. And we sat there on the bus bench with our breath steaming in the night air, till finally I said, "Well, now I can't get on the bus." And he said, "Oh, here." And he gave back $1, which was at the time the cost of a bus ride in Manhattan. And I said, "Thanks," to my mugger. And we sat there with our breath steaming in the night air until eventually the bus came. And I got up to get on the bus, and he was getting on right behind me and to my right. And I thought about saying to the bus driver, "Hey, this guy just mugged me." But at this point it was $5. So it felt less like reporting a crime than like telling on a guy. So I got on the bus and I found a seat and I sat down, and my mugger got on the bus and found a seat behind me and sat down. And we rode on southward about 4 or 5 blocks before he tapped me on the shoulder and handed me $2. Said, "Here, you always ought to have some cash on you." And I again said, "Thank you," to my mugger. And he went and sat down. And we rode on downtown until eventually he rang to get off the bus. And as the bus was pulling to a stop, he stopped by my seat and said, "You know, I really just needed bus fare. Why don't you take the rest of this money back?" But by now I felt like I had bonded with my mugger. So I said, "Why don't you hang on to that? You really always ought to have some cash on you." And my mugger said, "Hey, thanks," and got off the bus. Now all of this flashed through my mind as I was standing in my grove with the moonlight trickling down through the leaves, and these young Hispanic men were fanned out around me, and one of them was sort of taller than I was, and he said, "Excuse me, what did you just say?" And before I could formulate a response, the homeless guy stood up behind them and said, he said, and they all went, "Ah, Jesus." He said, "We're Druids, and we're using this grove right now. Could you come back in 10 or 15 minutes when we're done?" And they all spoke fast Spanish to each other, and their leader turned toward me and said, "So, 10 after 12? And I said, "Yeah, that'd be great." And he said, "Okay, thanks." And they turned to move off through the park, and I gave the homeless guy a big thumbs up and a smile, and he gave me a thumbs up and a smile, and he sat down to finish his dinner by the tree, and I turned to thank my tree for giving me this place of safety where nothing could harm me and everything was sacred. And I put my hands against the tree, and at this point I saw one of the young men turn back to look at us, and I smiled and I nodded, but apparently the shadows had swallowed me up again, because I heard him say to his friends, "Yo, dudes, where did they go? And how many do you think there were? And do you think they can really turn into bats?"